Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised. Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This podcast is produced and hosted by Chris Carr.
On today's podcast, we welcome back Dr Taras Kuzio, who has just returned from a trip to Ukraine. In the first section of this podcast, we discuss the recent ISIS-K terrorist attack in Moscow and how President Putin is capitalizing on that atrocity and attempting to blame Ukraine. We then move on to look at new Ukrainian tactics against Russia, and we look at the increasingly risk-averse US response to Russian aggression, both in Ukraine and with the recent reports about Havana syndrome. We then shift focus to Dr Kuzio's trip to Ukraine, in which he shares some of his observations from that trip, and then we look at how President Zelensky is holding up after recent reports that he has been at loggerheads with senior members of the Ukraine military. We also discuss some of the talking points about Ukraine on both sides of the political spectrum in the British and American press. And then after the break, Dr. Kuzio and I discuss some of the revelations from the New York Times piece on the Ukraine intelligence services and special forces, shedding light on their roles and actions. So it's a pretty jam-packed episode, and in the end we end on a few bonus questions looking at topics from the Nord Stream attack to Alexei Navalny's links to the far right. And also we talk about a strange conversation that I had with a taxi driver in London about Ukraine that left me scratching my head. So pour yourself your favourite drink, make yourself comfortable, and immerse yourself in this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a Patreon subscriber. Just go to patreon.com/secrets and spies. By becoming a subscriber, you'll not only get access to our Patreon-only shows called Extra Shot. Depending on which level you pick, you'll get a free coaster or coffee cup, which then you can put your favourite drink into and listen to this episode. So I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much. Take care.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Dr. Taras Kuzio, welcome back to the podcast. How are you?
I'm very good, and thank you for inviting me again.
It's good to have you back on. So for the benefit of listeners who may not have heard our past episodes, please could you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I was born in Britain to Ukrainian father, Italian mother, who came here after the war. I did all my education here. I've always worn a number of hats: academic, kind of journalistic, but more for the specialist publications, and also sometimes doing legal and political consultancy on things like political refugees from Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. I grew up in Soviet studies. That shows my age, but that became kind of post-Soviet, mainly Ukrainian, contemporary Ukrainian issues. But I also obviously have no choice but to keep abreast of Russia as well. Belarus is pretty easy because the same idiot's been in charge since 1995 or 4, sorry. That's pretty much it. I was thinking and hoping to sort of slowly ease my way into retirement, but a little gentleman with Napoleonic Stalinist tendencies in Moscow prevented that.
Yeah.
So it has disrupted my plans, and I don't think this war is going away anytime soon. Obviously not.
No, indeed. And obviously Putin just won the so-called election in Russia, so he's committed to staying for quite a long time.
Putin's is one of these corrupt autocrats who can never leave office for the simple fact there's no honor amongst thieves. So these corrupt autocrats have to stay in power forever, because they fear that if they are out of power and they're kind of growing potatoes on on an allotment somewhere, that they will be either put in prison by their enemies, or for certain, what they have stolen will be stolen from them. So they have to stay in power. Putin will be there until he literally pops his clogs.
Yeah, he will pretty much die like Stalin, won't he? And then the country will be in a total...
Yes. He's already 6 years beyond the average lifespan for Russian males. Which is about 64. The Russian government increased the pension age to 67 a few years ago, which is 3 years later than the average lifespan for Russian males. It's a good way of saving money for the government. But he's not a big boozer, Putin, so he still isn't in bad condition, but nevertheless 70 years old. But let's remember that the US presidential elections has two main candidates who are in their late 70s.
Indeed, and we'll probably touch upon that a bit later. But Taras, before delving into your recent journey to Ukraine, I'd like to hear your thoughts and reflections on the recent terrorist attack in Moscow, which now President Putin is trying to blame on Ukraine and the West, despite ISIS-K claiming responsibility for the attack. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the irony is that ISIS have become so frustrated by the Kremlin, that they've actually issued a couple of statements saying, it was us, come on. Because obviously they want to get credit for it, because that gets them followers and such like. So it's funny that they are frustrated. 2 points, really. Firstly, I'm surprised that most people are surprised that this has taken place. I'm not condoning it, of course, but at the same time, why should we be surprised when the main country in the Middle East, or the greater Middle East, being behind the killing of Muslims has been Russia? Firstly, in Chechnya, in 2 pretty brutal wars in the mid-90s and then in the early 2000s. The estimates for that are about 100,000, or 10% of the Chechen population were killed. That was ignored by the West because there was 9/11 and Russia needed to be one of our allies in the fight against global war on terrorism. Okay, so that's 100,000. But more importantly, Syria, where approximately 600,000 Sunni Muslims have died, and millions, something like 5 or 6 million, have fled abroad, caused by Russia intervening on behalf of the brutal Assad regime, and helping the Assad regime to use things like chemical weapons, which the West initially was going to oppose. Remember Obama's red lines? And then didn't. So we have a total of nearly 750,000 Muslims that you could lay at the hands of Putin's regime. So I'm more surprised that this hasn't happened earlier. I mean, apparently there have been quite a lot of smaller scale ISIS attacks or Islamic extremist attacks in Russia that haven't been really reported in the West. So this could not be not reported because it was in Moscow and it was such a high number of casualties, 144, about 140, I think, or more. So that's my first point. So we shouldn't be surprised that Sunni Muslim extremist groups like ISIS see Russia as their enemy. I'm just surprised it's taken them so long to do something like this, in view of the brutality of what Russia has done against the Muslim world. I mean, the second country that's been the most brutal towards Muslims has been China, which has locked up 1 million Sunni Uyghurs and done some appalling human rights atrocities against them, such as, for example, doing operations to prevent Muslim women from having future kids in China. So actually, it's not the West or the Americans or the Israelis that have done the worst against the Muslim world. It's actually Russia and China. So so as an expert and political scientist, for me, that's what's kind of interesting about all of this. As for the Ukraine angle, we should put this into the context that the Kremlin mindset, the Kremlin kind of ideological or Russian imperialist mindset, believes that Ukraine doesn't exist as a real country. This is an artificial construct, which is being propped up by the West. This goes back to even the late 19th century. Putin's revived this kind of conspiracy that Then it was the Austrians and Poles that were supporting Ukrainians as a separate people to Russians, and now Putin has kind of modernized this by adding the CIA, Americans, Washington, etc. So Ukraine is perceived in the eyes of these Kremlin leaders as an outpost of the West, as an anti-Russian outpost. They even call it Ukraine anti-Russia, and therefore they're going to try to pin these kinds of attacks in a culture of a fortress Russia on Ukraine as acting as an agent of the West. And they have said in the past, they have made claims in the past that the Taliban, when they've attacked Russians, that they've done that at the behest of the Americans. So they see Putin's been seeing an American hand behind lots of different things, both Islamic terrorism in Chechnya and elsewhere, and in Ukraine and in the Middle East for quite a long time. And so this just fits that pattern. Of course, the idea that Ukraine is behind this has been ridiculed by every single Western expert and government official. They just roll their eyes up at this kind of suggestion. But it's par for the course for the Kremlin. Lawrence Friedman, the professor emeritus from King's College, has a great new Substack that he writes, talking about the kind of the manic obsession that Vladimir Putin has about Ukraine, and this kind of fits into this. He sees conspiracies and plots against Russia, and it's just part of this mentality of fortress Russia. So here we go, where in reality, Ukraine is undertaking lots of other types of attacks, which are nothing to do with this ISIS attack on civilians. But we'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah. Sadly, with the case of Putin, it's why let an atrocity go to waste.
Yes, exactly. And just a final point on that, going back to what you just said, is that he's going to use this as a way of kind of fanning anti-Ukrainian sentiment, Ukrainophobia, to help him launch a second round of mobilization of Russians to fight in his war in Ukraine. So yes, you're right. He's going to use a terrorist attack like this to his benefit.
Yeah. So obviously there's been a new development in Ukraine's fight against the Russian invasion, and now Ukraine are using modified pilotless kind of kamikaze planes. What are your thoughts on that tactic?
Well, when I saw this, I said, this is obviously taking the Japanese kamikazes of World War II up to a new level, because this is something nearly 2,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. The Ukrainians are being very adept at innovating new methods to fight Russia. And this is part and parcel of having a very big volunteer movement, civil society, and also having a large base of the military-industrial complex, which they inherited from the Soviet Union. So plenty of people who are good at IT and military technology. And so you have lots of these small groups of civilians creating these new ideas, which they then offer to the Ukrainian military. And one of these is obviously this pilotless plane, which attacked an oil refinery, something like 1,800 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. The Biden administration is coming across as extremely weak in their condemnation of these attacks inside Russia. To me, it's not surprising, again, as an analyst, because the Biden administration is a continuation of Barack Obama, who was in power from 2009 to 2016. That administration ignored the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, did nothing in 2014 when Ukraine was invaded, and of course forgot about its red lines in Syria. So I'm not that surprised. It's come across as very weak. The Biden administration, when it came into power in 2020, lifted Donald Trump's sanctions against Nord Stream 2 as well, and has drip-fed military aid to Ukraine, because the Biden administration does not have as its goal the military defeat of Russia. It doesn't want Ukraine to lose the war. So it gives Ukraine sufficient to defend itself, but not enough for it to defeat, to be victorious and defeat Russia. These claims by US diplomats that they do not support Ukrainian attacks inside Russia are incredibly hypocritical. This is a country, the United States, that launches attacks everywhere in the globe against terrorist groups. I mean, they've killed countless people abroad, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Iraq and Iran and elsewhere. And of course, they intervened in Iraq in 2003. So the idea that just, the Americans, and then they don't say anything about what Israel is up to outside its borders. That's fine. There's no requirement for Israel, when it receives American military aid, to not use it outside its borders. It seems that Ukraine is being singled out here, that it can only fight this war against Russia with one arm tied up against its back. As you know, it's ironic that the French have come to the rescue of Ukrainians, and they've said under UN charter, Ukraine has every right to self-defense, including attacks inside Russia. Why do the Americans not understand that? Ukraine is doing nothing in launching these various attacks, particularly against oil refineries and gas installations and other military targets. It's not actually attacking any civilian targets here, and all of this is absolutely within the parameters of international law. So the Americans really are out of sync here with I think public opinion, with international law, and even with what they've done themselves. Again, I'm not surprised, because a new scandal that's just appearing now is the degree to which the Biden administration covered up Russia's use of what's being called the Havana syndrome, where the Russian military intelligence have been using these high level frequencies to against American diplomats, causing them much pain, and in some cases leading to cancer. And the Biden administration basically covered this up. This has now come out in an investigation and on CBC and various American television investigations. And the only explanation you can give for this is the same reason, really, the unwillingness of the Biden administration to take on the Russians for their aggression, whether it's Georgia 2008, Syria, Ukraine, and even against their own diplomats. So it reflects a very weak U.S. administration, and that unfortunately sends a really bad signal to Vladimir Putin and his cronies in the Kremlin, because the only thing they understand is toughness. They don't understand weakness. They laugh at it and they exploit it, and the Biden administration is sending that. For me, what was just on the final point on this. What's interesting as well is how we depict these American leaders in Europe, because Trump, of course, gets a very bad rap, rightly so. He continuously, him and his team continuously talk about how they don't want to send military aid to Ukraine because Ukraine's not a core U.S. interest. Well, actually, Barack Obama said the same thing. He also argued that Ukraine is not a core American interest, and therefore there's no need to provide some kind of support to Ukraine after 2014, even though the US was obligated to under the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons. So if Obama and Trump have the same viewpoint, then why is it only Trump is classified negatively as a populist and not Obama? Maybe Obama should be moving from the Democratic Party to the populist GOP.
Well, I think that might be a bit extreme, but yeah.
Well, or Trump is a closet Democrat, one of the two.
Well, didn't Trump once say he was a Democrat? I can't remember.
Well, yes, really, he's given financial donations to the Democrats and Republicans, sure.
Yeah. One little pushback on with the Havana syndrome. The Trump administration were also equally as guilty of covering it up and doing very little.
Right.
And I do wonder, in a hypothetical different world, how Trump would have reacted had he got a second term, how he actually would have reacted to the invasion of Ukraine, because I'm not convinced he would have given any real significant support. Maybe I'm wrong in that assumption.
Well, you're right in that sense that, I mean, what happened with military assistance after 2014 was that in the year that Russia invaded and annexed Crimea and then invaded the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, both British Prime Minister David Cameron and US President Barack Obama, both of them ignored their commitments to Ukraine security under the Budapest Memorandum, both of them. So it's not just a Barack Obama thing. You know, Cameron now struts around as British foreign minister with a very hawkish agenda. But back in 2014, he was very placid towards Russia and towards China, by the way, at the same time. So after that, both Cameron and Obama vetoed the sending of military aid to Ukraine, even though there was a low intensity conflict taking place for nearly 10 years. To Trump's credit, he did not veto the sending of military aid, but that military aid was light stuff. It wasn't heavy duty military aid. You're talking javelins and stingers and this kind of thing. What was in place at the time on the eve of Russia's invasion was a general common viewpoint amongst Western experts and Western policymakers. They actually agreed with the Kremlin that Ukraine would be quickly defeated. This was a viewpoint in the West as well as in Moscow. There were different reasons for this, but I've written about this. I've written a kind of a piece called 9 Things the West Got Wrong on the Invasion. They over exaggerated the reforms and the power of the Russian military, and they underlooked at the Ukrainian willingness to be resilient and to defend itself. So that led to a viewpoint in the US, which meant that the only thing that the US was prepared to send at the time of the invasion were weapons which Ukraine would use in a guerrilla war, because they assumed that Ukraine would be quickly occupied, quickly defeated, and then there would just be a need to send guerrilla weapons like javelins and stingers, NLAWs, to be used in a guerrilla war. They were wrong. The West was wrong here, and of course Russia was wrong. Ukraine put up a strong fight, and more than 2 years on, the war is still going on. But so Trump was a product of that milieu in Washington, which wasn't connected to, didn't matter which president was there. It just was a reflection of the experts that were around. I have worked in the 2000s in Washington, and there was a funny phrase that people used for these think tanks in Washington that get US government money. They call them the Beltway bandits. And because the Beltway being the sort of the M25, the circular road around Washington, where a lot of these think tanks like the Rand Corporation are based. As people have told me who work in those places, it's not in their interest to actually tell the US Pentagon that the Russian military is actually not very good. Because if they tell them that, then they'll get less money and the US Pentagon won't be able to get as much money from the US government, because the government will turn around and say, well, you don't really need that much because the Russian military is not very good. You can defeat them very quickly. So there's an actual inbuilt bias to exaggerate the strength, the power of the Russian military. And that was what was in place. And that was coupled with this kind of very deeply set view of Ukraine as a kind of a very divided country with all the sort of the Russian-speaking pro-Russian East. They would gladly welcome Russian troops. So all of that fed into this. And so Trump was better than Obama, but only in being willing to send light weapons, not in being willing to send heavy weapons. Biden then is in power when Ukraine's actually invaded. He does move, like other Western European countries, into sending heavier weapons because they see that Ukraine is fighting back. But these weapons only come about in about March, April, so 1 to 2 months after the invasion, when they can see that Ukrainians are not going to be defeated and they're going to fight back. Um, but the big criticism I've made in a think tank paper published in London is that this flow of military aid from the US and from Germany, because Chancellor Scholz always hides behind President Biden, as being drip fed. And we've talked about that before, about how that drip feeding is linked to this fear of escalation with Russia. Whereas the Brits, the Scandinavians, the Balts, the Poles, the Czechs have not really linked their supply of military aid to any kind of fear of escalation. They've openly stated that they seek the military defeat of Russia, whereas the Americans and Germans have never said that. So the Biden administration had to change when the invasion happened, but it never changed completely. It's never actually gone full throttle in supporting Ukraine.
Thank you. In light of, obviously, Havana syndrome, Russia's war in Ukraine, and Russia's kind of actions against the West that are quite obvious and been going on for a long time, what is an appropriate kind of pushback? What are the options sort of on the table? Because obviously this is sort of going on, and Russia are kind of getting away with not only invading countries but murdering people across their borders and so on. And so what are the options on the table to Biden and the international community?
Well, I think the first thing one would answer to that question is that unless you want to be fighting Russia yourself, i.e. NATO, then you have to support Ukraine. I think it's quite commonly accepted now that that Vladimir Putin's Russia will not stop if it defeats Ukraine. So the choices open to the West are really twofold: an indirect conflict with Russia, where they're supporting Ukraine, or a direct conflict with Russia with Ukraine defeated. I mean, those are the only two options. And if it's far more dangerous for the world if there's a direct war between NATO and Russia, because that could definitely, and there's more chance of it escalating to a nuclear war. So then, if that's the case, then it's far more preferable for NATO and for Western countries to give the means to Ukraine for it to successfully defeat the Russian military. I think there's a number of things that have to be done. Firstly, there needs to be a move to that British, Scandinavian, Polish, Baltic mindset amongst particularly the Germans and the Americans, that the goal is Russia's military defeat. The Americans and Germans have never said that. They should openly come out and say that. That I think is an important kind of ideological position, because from that flows the means of how to do that. And the means are to stop holding back things like long-term these missiles such as German Taurus missile, and also the American ATACMS, which have a long range. Stop holding back on items like that. Stop holding back on the supply of military equipment. For example, Ukraine has been supplied with something like 50, I forget the numbers are different, depending on who you quote, 50 to 100 Abrams tanks. America has thousands of these just sitting in desert compounds. They're not doing anything. Why is not more of those being sent? Why are these long-range missiles not being sent? So Ukraine needs to be given the means to defeat Russia, and that the steps for that would be, firstly, liberation of southeastern Ukraine, breaking through the means to break through those fortification lines. So that includes jets, long-range missiles, and demining equipment, those kinds of things. Once Ukraine has broken through and liberated the southeast, then Crimea is under threat. I think the two kind of sub-goals of that Russia's military defeat, which would potentially either lead to a change of leader in Moscow or Putin being forced to negotiate, are firstly these attacks inside Russia, which are heavily damaging Russia's main export of oil and gas. That's one area, the continuation of that. And secondly, having Ukrainian troops liberated southeastern Ukraine, them standing on the Black Sea coastline and threatening Russia's hold over Crimea. I think those two, plus maybe tightening up sanctions, which don't seem to be as tight as they could be vis-a-vis Russia. For example, there's now pressure on India to no longer buy Russian crude oil. Why was that not done 2 years ago? So I think those two or three areas would enable Ukraine to take the fight, to no longer, like this year, Ukrainians are defending, not attacking, to actually launch offensives and to defeat Russia. But I think the Americans and the Germans need to have a change in mindset to do that. The Germans will arrive at that if the Biden administration does, because Scholz always follows the lead of Biden, whether it's on tanks or other military equipment. First it's the Americans, then it's the Germans. That would give Ukraine the means, and then behind all of that, of course, the Europeans need to get their act together, need to increase their defense budgets, because the Francis Fukuyama's End of History that he wrote about back in 1991 is over. History's come full scale back and hit you in the face. You need to realize Europe is in a new Cold War.
Yeah, history is back and it's not going anywhere.
No, it's not. I mean, that book, you look, I've got it on my shelf, and you look at it now and go, God, this is an optimistic book.
On the Thames, you get these boats that were commissioned during the millennium, and they've got things like Millennium of Peace as their name and things like that. And yeah, I do miss that 90s optimism, but unfortunately it's long gone now.
It's long gone, yeah. And there still seems to be a kind of unwillingness to accept that amongst because if you accept it, then there are consequences. You need to change government priorities. I mean, and it's not just. I think for us living in Britain, one of the strangest aspects of all of this is why the British military have declined so much under a party that always the Conservatives, that always prided itself on being pro-military and pro-national security. I mean, the British military now is the smallest since the Napoleonic Wars, and the Air Force is the smallest since World War II. So what's going on here?
Yeah, and good luck persuading the public that should change.
Well, I think this is part and parcel of this kind of unwillingness to be frank to the public and to say, "Hey, guys, we're back in the Cold War," and I think many governments, you're right, are unwilling to do that.
Well, thank you for that. You've just recently come back from a trip to Ukraine, and I was wondering if you'd be happy to talk about some of the things that you did there and what you've kind of learned from that trip.
I've done various types of volunteer work here. There are many volunteer groups in Britain doing things vis-a-vis Ukraine. They're either doing it, and there are other ones in Western Europe. They're either doing stuff directly with the military or doing both military and humanitarian work. The group I went out with is a group called Vans Without Borders, mainly based in the south of England. A couple of ex-military guys, but a real mishmash of people, all with good hearts, taking time off work and heading out there in all types of professions, because after all, they have to give up at least a month of their lives, of time off work, and there's always a cost involved because your travel expenses are paid by yourselves. So we went out on the 8th of February in 6 kind of, I don't know what you call them, they're not really pickup trucks because they have, the backs of them are covered, with the aim of leaving 4 of them behind with the Ukrainian military. 2 would come back. The average age of these guys they're in the sort of mid to late 20s. So I realized that maybe this wasn't a good idea to drive all the way from England to Ukraine via Warsaw. It was a long drive. So next time, probably I'll meet them. I'll fly in to Poland and meet them in Ukraine. They took with them military and humanitarian aid. I mean, the kind of things that these people are taking in, including other friends of mine, are drones, various types of drones, either purchased, ironically purchased on places like Amazon, or they're homemade. These kamikaze drones are just literally homemade ones. They cost about £300 to make, and Starlink terminals, which I was very surprised to hear are so cheap. I just assumed they were going to be costing in their thousands, and they took them with them, and they cost something like £450 brand new, or £250, I believe, refurbished. And they said the refurbished ones were just as good. So I guess the Starlink makes most of its money on the monthly subscription, not on the actual terminal itself. But the monthly subscriptions are paid for by the Pentagon, as far as I understand. So the Ukrainians are not paying for those. So we met various local volunteers, both Westerners and Ukrainians, in the Western Ukraine, Lviv, Kyiv, and then we drove to the southeast, a place called Kryvyi Rih, which is President Zelensky's hometown, and then from there went closer to the front line to deliver various military things, including things like uniforms and clothes, winter clothes, to people near the front line, to troops near the front line. I mean, these would be contacts that Vans Without Borders already had, and I think what happens is that these volunteer groups have already established links to certain units, and they kind of deal with those units, so there's no real overlap. Units are not getting supplies from different humanitarian groups, and then we went further east via Kharkiv, which is only about 30-40 miles from the border, and therefore it's had a bit of a hammering. You do notice that the further east you drive, the more the cities show a sense of hammering, and I understand that being because it's very difficult to intercept drones and missiles if you're so close to the Russian border compared to, say, Kiev and especially West Ukraine. So in the center of Kharkiv, I mean, it's not as bad as I think sometimes it's portrayed, but the kids there are doing their classes in the underground, in the metro system, as opposed to in schools. And quite a few of the buildings' windows are boarded up, and often things like council meetings are done online, not in the actual council building. From there, we went further east, closer to the Russian lines, places like Kupiansk and Izium. They met some Ukrainian soldiers there, which they've previously had contact with, and these were Ukrainian security service drone operators, and they delivered them some drones and Starlink terminals. We also visited a unit which is this is about 1 hour east of Kharkiv driving, and it was a small unit. I don't know how small, maybe 10, 12 people, based in somebody's house who had fled, about 8 kilometers from the border, and they would be doing reconnaissance and drone attacks. Again, for me, what's fascinating is to see the mixture of people there. You've got, it was very obvious that the person in charge of the technical stuff was a computer. I don't want to say this in a negative way, but a computer geek. He just looked like that. I mean, when I talked to him, he did say that before the war he ran his own private computer company, which he then took that expertise and is applying it vis-a-vis Russia again in the war. And then you had a mixture of other people. I mean, for me as a political scientist and as an academic, what's interesting as well is to look at the regional demographics and language demographics about the soldiers on the Ukraine side, because there's a lot of exaggerated, or there used to be at the very least, a lot of exaggeration about Ukraine's divisions between Russian, Ukrainian speakers, East and Western Ukraine. I always thought this was exaggerated because most Russian speakers in Ukraine have shown themselves to be patriotic Ukrainians. That was true back in 2014 when Russia first invaded, and it's true today. And it's not that unusual. I mean, just think of two countries near us in England, Scotland. Gaelic is only spoken by 5% of the people in Scotland, the northwest. And Ireland, most people still speak English as their first language in Ireland, even though Gaelic is taught in schools. That doesn't make Irish people less patriotic because they speak English. And so I think we should move away from this more Germanic French understanding of that if you don't speak Ukrainian, you're somehow, you're a supporter of Russia. That's simply not the case. And so many of these Ukraine soldiers were often locals, people from Kharkiv or elsewhere, and therefore they were either bilingual or often Russian speakers, and different age groups. Again, one of the things that you often read in the West is that the average age of soldiers is sort of in Ukraine is in their early 40s. I saw a lot of young people, people in their 20s, not just people in their 40s. The other thing you often get in Western media is that morale is quite low, and I didn't get that sense either. Not from the people I met. I mean, Izium was fascinating, Izium and Kupiansk, because these were areas which were occupied by Russia until September 2022, when the Russian army was routed and it fled from there. So, and Ukraine liberated most of Kharkiv region. So there was a lot of military equipment. We were sat waiting for our guys to arrive in a kind of a small coffee house, eating place. And there was just lots of stuff just driving past all the time, military equipment driving past, tanks and trucks and other things. So for me as an analyst, what's interesting is seeing how volunteers work, see how they interact with the locals, and experiencing the talking to the soldiers. One of the most fascinating meetings was in Zelensky's hometown of Kryvyi Rih, because we were by chance invited one evening to a kind of an annual anniversary get-together of veterans from the Afghanistan war in the 1980s. So these guys are tough ex-paratroopers and such like. They like a bit of a drink. I just assumed stereotypically that many of these would be pro-Russian because they were kind of, they fought for the Soviet Union in the 80s in Afghanistan. And I was pleasantly surprised to see to what degree they were virulently anti-Russian. Now, remember, for your listeners, what's interesting, what's happened since 2014, and especially since 2022, is that prior to 2014, the only really hardcore group of Ukrainians who, shall we say, really hated Russians would have been West Ukrainians. And those were the kind of people that came to Britain after the war, just because of geography, really. and so like my father's from West Ukraine. What's happened since 2014, and especially 2022, the full-scale invasion, is that that anti-Russian hatred has spread to the rest of the country. When you read opinion polls today, we're talking about only 3-5% of Ukrainians hold a positive view of the Russian people. And these Afghan veterans, or veterans of the Afghan war, were an example of that. I was sort of pleasantly surprised to hear how they just were talking in very, very hostile, negative terms. And the reasons for that were that they were looking at this as fathers and as kind of brothers, as it were. And they were looking at this in terms of younger people getting killed, either fighting in the war or getting killed as civilians. And for them, this was just shocking. And I think it's also, it's more of a shock for people from that part of Ukraine, the eastern part, which was used to be Russian speaking. For them, it was a shock that Russians are doing this to them, because they always had this kind of misapprehension that Russians were somehow their close friends, close brothers. This is how they were brought up in the Soviet Union. And yet the biggest brutality of this war has taken place in Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, in the east and south, not in the west of the country. So today, there is simply no difference in how you will find hatred for the Russian regime, for Putin's regime, and for the Russian people in the east as much as in the west of the country. That is something that Vladimir Putin has led to in Ukraine. And so talking to people like that helps me, it gives me credibility to talk about these kind of issues, because I'm not only just reading articles from Ukraine or opinion polls, I'm actually talking to people on the ground. So those would be the kind of reflections that I came back with. I'm always stunned to meet people like that. I mean, I've that's happened in the past, but you don't necessarily expect it from the industrial parts of Ukraine, which were traditionally quite Soviet and quite pro-Russian. But Putin's invasion and the war crimes committed by the Russian army have changed everything in the country.
No, indeed. Well, thank you very much for sharing all that. That is very interesting, especially about the Russian speakers. I have a bonus question we may get to later about this conversation. I have a taxi driver that was quite, I don't know, enlightening and disappointing. And I think he came from a kind of far left persuasion. And one of his points was that Putin was somehow rescuing Russian speakers in Ukraine, which just strikes me as a bit bonkers, really.
Well, of course it's bonkers, and opinion polls show that in Ukraine. Only something like 3-5% of Ukrainians believe this propaganda garbage. And the very actions of the Russian army show this not to be true. The cities and villages and towns which are being destroyed by the Russian army, from which people are either being killed or having to flee, losing all their worldly possessions, are actually Russian speakers. They're the ones suffering the most in this war. I mean, the port of Mariupol, which had a population of 450,000, was flattened by the Russian army. This is a port which was Russian speaking and also tended to vote for pro-Russian parties. So the idea that the Russian army is coming to protect or defend Russian speaking simply is just laughable. I mean, it's just not true, and it can be very easily discounted.
Yeah, indeed. Well, they don't seem to be interested in winning hearts and minds, the Russians.
No, that very concept, I guess, which Western armies have tried to do, failing or otherwise, in many places, the Russian army has never adopt. This is basically the same. It's the same Soviet army that did what it did in World War II, and raped, pillaged, and destroyed as it moved across Europe to Berlin in 1943, 44, 45. It's the same mentality, same army.
Yeah, indeed. Now, one question I was to ask you, I want to get a sense, or if you've got a sense of how President Zelensky is sort of holding up, because there's been an awful lot of speculation since we last spoke about his popularity in Ukraine and questions about his relationship with the military at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of this is a bit exaggerated by the Western media, but some of it probably is spot on. I think that what it reflects from the kind of end of last year, beginning of this year, is that we're in a transition period of perceptions. Last year there was a lot of optimism that Ukraine's offensive would quickly defeat the Russian army. Ukraine would get down to the coast, the Azov Sea, quite quickly. Now we have a different kind of perception, which is that this war is going to last a lot longer than we imagined. When you read his history books, you realize that this often happens in wars. In World War I, we thought the war would be over, or the British thought the war would be over by Christmas, and it lasted another 4 years. And the same here. Many Ukrainians maybe hoped as well as believed that the war would end very quickly with Russia. The Russian army would be defeated based on the fact that Ukraine was quite successful in 2002 and the first half of 2023. But the Russian army did adapt, and in particular, the Russian army was given 8 to 9 months, when the West kind of dithered, as it were, and supplied arms in a very drip fashion. The training and everything else was very slow. The arrival of tanks, the jets still haven't arrived. And that 8 to 9 months allowed the Russians, after the rout of the Russian army in September 22, it allowed the Russians 8 to 9 months to build 3 lines of fortification, lay tens of thousands of mines, and to launch a mass mobilization of 300 or 1,000 plus people. And that solidified that southeast occupation part of Ukraine. And it also was made more difficult to, as it were, penetrate and liberate because of this transformation of technology in this war. This Ukrainian-Russian war is going to be transformative not only for the Ukrainian and Russian armies, but for Western armies, where it's very difficult for armies to advance forward when you've got drones in the sky all the time, because those drones will just destroy anything that's moving. And that makes it very difficult as well to advance forward. So I think some of this negativity around Zelensky is related to this transition of this perception that oh my God, we now have to realize that this war could last a long time. And the secondary knock-on effect of that is seen in Europe, where European leaders, particularly Emmanuel Macron, the French president, are also now openly saying, wow, this is going to be a much more difficult, longer war, and we have to prepare for it. So I think there are a lot of factors here. In the case of Zelensky, I think there was a brewing conflict with the head of the armed forces, Valery Zaluzhny. He published an article, quite a detailed article in The Economist in November of last year, and he probably mistakenly published it without getting permission. I guess that would be a problem in any Western country as well. If the head of the British Armed Forces, for example, published something critical without consulting first with the Prime Minister and the government. And so Zelensky wasn't very happy, particularly because Zaluzhny basically said, the offensive's over, because it's winter time, and we're in a period of stalemate. And I don't think Zelensky particularly liked that phrase, stalemate. So that conflict between them two culminated in Zaluzhny being removed, being replaced, and being sent to Britain as the new Ukrainian ambassador to United Kingdom.
Do you think I'll be able to get him on here one day?
Yes. I mean, he would be. I mean, the problem that you're going to have, of course, is he's not going to be able to, because he's an official person. They can't say much. Can't be very open in what they say. I experienced that once in my life when I worked for NATO in the late 1990s, where I had to watch every word I said, and I hated it.
Yeah.
So I think that those are the reasons for this. And Zelensky, I guess the final factor is Zelensky's quite frustrated about Western support, particularly the US. In the US, it's the sort of the holdup in American support for Ukraine since the end of last year. And the Europeans are getting more active, but it's just a very slow process in Europe. So that impacts on the ground in Ukraine, with more Ukrainians dying at the front line.
Yeah. This is the thing, isn't it? Like all the slow walking with weapons upgrades, and now there's efforts in the States to block more aid to Ukraine. It's costing lives. And, I wanted to ask you about these efforts to block more aid to Ukraine in the US. There's sort of circles on the right and the far left that are questioning why the US is continuing to spend so much on aid when they have domestic issues themselves sorted out. So I suppose, what are your thoughts on what's kind of going on in the US at the moment, and to some of those arguments in the US that feel like they should be spending more domestically?
Well, I think that one of the kind of factors here is that we've got a candidate who, I mean, back in 2016, Trump wasn't so bad towards Ukraine as he could be now. I think that's something important to stress, because it's never so black and white on these issues. In many ways, the Trump presidency back then, 16 to 20, was far better than the Barack Obama presidency. Barack Obama and British Prime Minister Cameron in 2014 completely forgot their obligations to Ukraine under the Budapest Memorandum, this document signed in 1994, in return for Ukraine getting rid of its nuclear weapons, that they would provide some security assurances to Ukraine. Both Obama and Cameron ignored those in 2014, and both Britain and America refused to provide Ukraine with any military aid throughout that period from 2014 up until the full-scale invasion. I think that only changed a few months before the full-scale invasion. So Trump did not veto, unlike Obama, Trump did not veto the supply of weapons then. And Trump was also better on Nord Stream gas pipeline. Trump imposed sanctions. Biden, when he became president in 2020, removed those sanctions. So it's never black and white on these kinds of issues. And of course, Cameron back in 2014 he was pretty useless. He didn't help Ukraine at all, and now he's the foreign minister of the British government, and he's a big hawk. So we have to be careful about these. But Trump seems to be today has moved further to the right, to the populist nationalist right, and he's also got a personal grudge with Zelensky going back to 2020, because during the election campaign he tried to pressure Zelensky to help him defeat Biden by finding dirt on Biden. And this was a long discussion, but which maybe for a separate episode, of how the Kremlin supplied dirty and often made-up intelligence through various intermediaries to Giuliani, Trump's lawyer, and some other people, so that Trump could use that against Biden. And Zelensky wanted no part of this, And I think that led to, when you cross Trump, he becomes personal. He doesn't forget that. And that led to Trump's first impeachment. So I think that is hanging over over a potential Trump victory. I think, and it's why it's unusual from people who have been watching America for many years, is that traditionally, including in the Cold War, it was the Republicans who were the hawks vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and Russia, and today that's no longer the case. It's the Democrats. Now there are many Republicans who are not. Who are sympathetic to Ukraine and want to support Ukraine, particularly in the Senate. So it's really a question of this being blocked in the House of Representatives, not in the Senate, and also the fact this is all the aid to Ukraine has been linked to the border problems with Mexico, the immigration problems. We'll see if Trump is elected or not, because I think many American voters are not happy that the fact that both of these old candidates who seem to have various ailments, both of them, they're not happy that the election is giving them just a choice between them. So we'll see who wins. But I'm not always so pessimistic if Trump wins, because I simply just can't see how he can change so much very quickly. Trump claims he can bring peace about in Ukraine within 24 hours. Well, good luck. That's not going to be the case. The Russians are always good at angering people, even people who are their friends. And also, I think what works in Ukraine's favor is the fact that even the populist nationalists and the Republican Party want to support Israel, and you can't really separate Israel and Ukraine today. I mean, both countries are faced by an Iranian-Russian alliance against them, with North Korea in the background. And if you want to support Israel, you really should be supporting Ukraine, and the other way around as well. Iran wants to destroy and erase from the map Israel, and Russia wants to do that with Ukraine. And so Iran and Russia have a very close military alliance, and Iran and Russia both believe that they're already at war with the West. So a lot has changed since the 7th of October 2023 Hamas terrorist attack on Israel, and that has brought Israel and Ukraine together, and Israel today is covertly providing Ukraine for the first time with military aid, which it refused to do before the Hamas attack. So I mean, that has to have an impact. Also, of course, this entire anti-Western axis and war impacts upon Taiwan as well, which is another country that the United States has security relationship with. If Ukraine would be militarily defeated, that would embolden China to launch an invasion of Taiwan. China is closely watching what's going on in the Western response to the Russian-Ukrainian war, and hasn't got involved in terms of supplying military aid to Russia, but is certainly helping Russia in other ways. For example, in non-military economic trade, oil and gas, and these kinds of areas. But international relations is all about signals, and a military defeat in Ukraine would have dire ramifications for Europe. Macron keeps saying that today, and it would have dire ramifications, I think, for Israel and for Taiwan. So anybody who comes to power in the US has to understand that. We shall see.
Yeah. One last question on this, and then we'll move on to Ukrainian intelligence. I've noticed on the left, and the reason why I focus on the left is because I would identify myself as a centre leftist, not a far leftist. But what I'm noticing on talking points on the left is that the West is increasingly being portrayed as the sole warmonger, and that ultimately any potential conflict with China or obviously aid to Ukraine that's sort of tackling Russia is seen as just Western warmongering. I don't know if you have any sort of thoughts on that.
This is a long-standing, I would say, argument, particularly stronger, I would say, far more stronger in 2014 than today. Um, and this is the Jeremy Corbyn argument. I mean, this is the argument of the former leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, and people of a similar ilk. And I think that argument about, it's the West moving into Russia's sphere of influence, NATO enlargement, the Americans again, all of that is something that was very strong in 2014, and that kind of group of people tended to blame the Americans and NATO for what was taking place. They let Putin off the hook, as it were, and I think that's less true today. One reason being, of course, because Corbyn is no longer around, and there isn't really another group of another political group in Britain that is Russophile besides the Corbyn group, and they're pretty marginalized now. But you still will have that kind of influence, I think, in other countries, particularly in Germany and France. I think many people see the German Chancellor Scholz as part of that kind of tendency, because he was very left-wing in the 1980s, sort of in the German equivalent of what we had in Britain, the CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. And this feeds into Germany's reluctance to supply Ukraine with certain weapons, particularly the Taurus long-range missile. But I don't think it's as strong in Britain, or say, for example, the United States, as it was back in 2014. And what you tend to see today amongst that kind of far left group of people is they camouflage their Russophilism, because they can't be openly pro-Russia today in the same way as they were in 2014. So they camouflage it and they can't be as openly pro-Russian today as 2014 because of Russia's reputation. Four Russian senior people, including Putin, have been criminally charged by the International Criminal Court. Russia's committing horrendous war crimes in all sorts of different ways in Ukraine. So you can't be openly pro-Russian. So the way they camouflage themselves today is by calling for peace. And they do that by saying we need to freeze the conflict. Of course, that works in Russia's favor, because Russia then gets to keep what it's occupied. What's thrown out of the window straight away is the internationally recognized principle of a country's right to territorial integrity, sovereignty over its territory, a basic principle of the United Nations. That's all thrown out the window. No, we need to stop the bloodshed. We'll do that by freezing the conflict. And then and they don't actually say, well, this works in Russia's favor. And anyway, it won't stop the conflict, because Putin and other Russian leaders have openly said on many occasions that their goal isn't just to capture what they've captured in southeastern Ukraine. Their goal is the destruction of Ukraine as a country and identity, and to capture other cities, particularly Kharkiv, Kyiv, Dnipro, and Odessa. So, but they don't talk about that. They just say that they try to portray themselves as peacemakers by calling for a freezing of the conflict. So it's quite disingenuous, and and it can be very easily pulled up. Um, but of course they're going to be around, and they're going to be probably quite active on social media. But I think politically, you're only really going to find them in places like France and Germany.
Yeah. I think I would say that I've noticed via the Israel-Gaza conflict that it seems that seems to now be the gateway for this sort of attitude to become more popular again.
Yeah, and that should be relatively easy to counter, because I think it's a reflection, the protests on the streets about what's going on against Israeli policy in Gaza. Fair enough. If you want to condemn the Israeli army, I have zero problem with that. But then, are you not being a bit anti-Semitic in your choice of what you condemn and don't condemn? The country that has committed the biggest amount of war crimes against Muslims is Russia, and then secondly China. China, because it's locked up 1 million Muslims in Chinese Turkestan, and Russia, firstly in Chechnya in 2001, when Putin came to power, his campaign against Chechen nationalists and separatists murdered about a tenth of the population, and most importantly, 600,000 Syrians were killed. Sunni Muslims were murdered by the Assad regime in cahoots with Russia. Why were those left-wing activists and students who are protesting today about Gaza, where were they when 600,000 Muslims were being murdered in Syria? That's a lot more than any Palestinians have been murdered. So I think that we should use this kind of argument. Why are they not protesting outside the Chinese embassy about the locking up of 1 million Muslims? Or is it just that you don't care about the Muslims, actually? What you do care about is you don't like Israel. I mean, that's the crux of the issue, isn't it? I mean, with these. And that's really very easy to prove, because they've completely ignored war crimes committed by Russia and human rights abuses committed by Russia and China.
Yeah. I bore friends and family to death with bringing up Russia. Because I hear a lot about everything else, but I hear a lot about the crimes of the West, but people seem to never ever mention Russia, and then I've been told, well, people know history, and you're supposed to take it as a given that people consider Russia, but I don't see evidence of people considering Russia when they talk about these things.
No, especially the Syria. I mean, 600,000 killed, massive migration. I think millions, 3-5 million people from Syria. Where were the protests and student demonstrations on campuses about that?
Yeah, indeed. Well, let's take a quick break, and then we'll be right back. Well, let's move on. We're going to look at the Ukrainian intelligence services, and who've been incredibly effective during this war. And so I suppose my first question is a broad one, maybe even considered a stupid one, but why is intelligence collection important, and what kind of information is useful in a state of war?
I would certainly point your listeners, if they have the opportunity, to try and find this very, very long and detailed investigation by the New York Times month or 2 months ago on CIA cooperation with Ukrainian intelligence, which has been taking place since 2014, because that was extremely informative. And I think what was interesting from that is something that's reflected across the board in this war, is that many Western militaries and intelligence services, including NATO, are getting a huge amount of experience, intelligence, information about military capabilities, warfare, how it's undertaken, and intelligence gathering. And this investigation by the New York Times showed to what degree the CIA and the Americans were actually getting a lot more from this relationship with Ukrainian intelligence than the Ukrainians were getting, because their various listening posts, or wherever you want to call them, near the front lines were collecting a lot of intelligence, and they were collecting intelligence also from ongoing activities by Ukraine's security services, both inside Russia and vis-a-vis Russia. So I think that what's changed, most notably, is the degree to which there's a lot more cyber warfare, hacking, collection. The ability to collect intelligence and data is far more superior than we would have imagined in the past. And that most blatantly came out into the public domain when the Americans, for the first time in history, openly talked about Russian invasion plans in the months running up to the full-scale invasion. And the Americans started talking about this and revealing that they had this intelligence from about the autumn of 2021. So and they had extremely detailed intelligence, i.e. the very day and how the Russians were going to invade Ukraine. So that showed you American capabilities then, and the capabilities have grown even more since then with the cooperation with Ukraine. From what I understand, and I think you're going to lead on to this, the cooperation is more likely to be with Ukrainian military intelligence as opposed to the security service of Ukraine, because I think these are two quite different bodies. And one factor there is that these Ukrainian intelligence services are doing a lot of activities inside Russia, and with Russian oppositionists, both of the military variety. About a week ago, 3 Russian volunteer battalions, the Russian Freedom Legion, the Russian Volunteer Corps, and the Siberian Battalion entered Russia, and these have been funded and trained by Ukrainians and run by Ukrainian military intelligence. They are now fighting inside Russia and taking over territory. And this plus many other types of activities are being undertaken by Ukrainian intelligence, and in some cases, I think, in cooperation with Western intelligence services. I'm sure that it's not just the CIA on the ground. There must be the British and other intelligence services there as well, scooping up what the Ukrainians and Americans are collecting. But the kind of things that they would be interested in is, of course, Russian military type of warfare, doctrine, how they undertake military activities, battles, who are the officers, what are their capabilities or weaknesses. I mean, all the kinds of things that you can imagine. And some of that information, by the way, is also undertaken by talking to prisoners of war, from whom you always will get a lot of intelligence. I remember during my student days, I would use some of this kind of stuff from the 1980s, because the Americans, in even as far back as then, through kind of think tanks like the RAND Corporation, which has strong ties to the Department of Defense, they would be interviewing Soviet prisoners of war in Afghanistan, about the Soviet army and about internal conflicts and attitudes and to what degree they were good at fighting or not. And these were published. Some of this data, probably not all, was published, and I used some of that in my master's degree. So they've been doing this for a long time, but then the capabilities were far less. Literally, you had to fly to Afghanistan and talk to prisoners of war. Now you can still talk to Russian prisoners of war, but you can also scoop a lot of stuff from intercepts, um, not only hacking and cyber warfare, but also you see this on social media to some degree. Um, a lot of intercepts of Russian mobile telephones, Russian soldiers in occupation duties in Ukraine ringing colleagues or family friends back home. A lot of these are intercepted as well by Ukrainian intelligence.
Can you give us a brief sort of overview of the different intelligence services in Ukraine and what each of them sort of does? And I'm also quite interested in how things changed in 2014, because from that New York Times article, it was quite interesting to see that the Americans sort of didn't trust the Ukrainians, and then it took a big effort around 2014 to kind of win the Americans over, who then, it appears, sort of semi-reluctantly started getting more involved with the Ukrainians.
Yeah, I mean, I think the distrust was partly correct in that the security service of Ukraine, which was the structure that inherited, was came originally from the Soviet KGB. They had been infiltrated, and they did have agents there. In particular, what happened during the Yanukovych presidency, pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych was president from 2010 to early 2014, and he allowed, permitted the Russian Secret Service, both GRU and FSB, to take control of Ukrainian intelligence de facto, and to infiltrate a lot of Ukrainian both military and security services, and he was criminally charged for treason because of that. I mean, Yanukovych fled to Moscow in February 2014, where he still lives. So back in 2014, there was inevitably going to be suspicion about the security service of Ukraine because of its KGB roots, and because it had been so much penetrated during the Yanukovych presidency from 2010 2014. I think that's a lot of that has changed. You might get still the occasional spy, but it's pretty much been cleaned up, particularly since 2022. But I think the article says, and I think experience shows, that there's probably greater cooperation with Ukrainian military intelligence, HRU, because that's a more, you could call that more of a post-Soviet body, and so there isn't really. I've never heard of anybody being arrested in HRU for being a Russian agent. It tends to be a much younger crowd. The head of Ukrainian military intelligence, Budanov, is only in his late 30s, for example. And so these are people who grew up on the whole in the post-Soviet period, and so the structure and the people there don't have the old boy network to the former Soviet KGB and to Russia, which is not the case in the security service of Ukraine. So I think the CIA probably has greater, I think if I remember from this article, it has greater cooperation with Ukrainian military intelligence rather than with the security service, precisely because of that. I mean, one didn't hear of the Ukrainian military intelligence being penetrated by the Russians to the degree that the security service was. And many of these attacks inside Russia are often done by Ukrainian military intelligence. Although the siege drones, I think, are both structures, but inside Russia, like various sabotage attacks, working with Russian opposition groups, such as those burning down military enlistment officers, and placing and helping to bring in, to help drones attack, training and financing these Russian volunteer battalions. I think more of that's done by the Ukrainian military intelligence.
Yeah. Do you have much insight into some of the activities that the intelligence services have been up to during the war? Because, I mean, obviously we've read a bit about there's been the odd assassination, there's been these sabotage operations. There's all sorts of interesting sort of stuff that's potentially going on that might well be linked back to the Ukrainians. I was wondering if you had any insight in any of that.
Obviously, we will probably not know everything until the war ends, but I think everything that you've said shows the ingenuity that the Ukrainians are doing, and that does include assassinations inside Russia, but also inside occupied Ukraine. I think pretty much everything that they're doing inside Russia is also being done in occupied Ukraine. So yes, assassinations in the case of occupied Ukraine, collaborators. In the case inside Russia, more hawkish Russian nationalists. For example, this sort of neo-fascist Alexander Dugin, he was the target, but somehow he didn't get in the car, and it was his daughter who was also of the same ideological ilk, which he was killed instead. Dugin was always a strong sort of far-right supporter of Putin, and in 2014 called for Ukrainians to be killed. And also separatist leaders. There's been a long run of pro-Russian separatist leaders in the east of Ukraine who have been assassinated, particularly those who have been accused of war crimes, the murdering, for example, of prisoners of war. There's other cases of, for example, supporting Russians on the ground, Russians creating arson attacks on important Russian factories, producing for the military. I saw an interview with 3 anarchists who talked about having networks throughout Russia, and they were creating arson attacks and particularly attacks on enlistment officers. So there's that. Some of the funniest would be hacking into Russian TV, and also transmitters or radios played in shops in Russian cities, and they would broadcast Zelensky's speeches or some kind of patriotic Ukrainian music, and you would see these CCTV cameras footage of Russians completely baffled as to what's going on, because the TV cameras got Ukrainian music blaring away, or Zelensky giving a speech in Russian saying how bad the war is. So yes, hacking that kind of thing, intercepting phone calls and playing those back on various social media and back into Russia. Playing some of the biggest, I think, coups have been hacking into central Russian TV, and instead of a program by Putin, some kind of meeting that Putin was having, it would be there would be something else played instead, some anti-war program, or Zelensky giving a speech, or somebody else giving a speech in Russian. The ingenuity is, I think, one of the areas that has attracted, in that article, the New York Times article, the CIA has attracted them to continue cooperating with Ukrainians. It is baffling that the Russians never really understood that, because when they invaded in February 2022, it's as though they imagined Ukrainians were going to charge at them with pitchforks. And did they not remember that in the Soviet Union, Ukraine had a big chunk of the Soviet military-industrial complex? This wasn't a backward place. Something like 40% of the Ukrainian economy was the military-industrial complex. Ukraine had a lot of the nuclear weapons production and the research and innovation surrounding that was done in Ukraine, including cybernetics and areas like that. And that has translated today into lots of volunteerism surrounding the making of new weapons. So you have a lot of Ukrainians working out of small garages and small factories, which are making new things, which are then offered to the military, and they say, "Yeah, this is great," and then they build it up and build it into a more mass production. And so you've got the Soviet past, as it were, with the military technology, coupled with the strong base in IT. Ukraine's got a massive IT sector, and they gain a lot of that comes from the Soviet past as well, from the various research institutes which were needed to build things like nuclear weapons. And that coupled with a very open society, unlike Russia. So Ukraine has a very big volunteer movement, civil society, and so very a lot of people backing up the army, as it were, in doing various volunteer type of work. And all of that taken together means that Ukrainians are always coming up with new ideas and new ways of fighting the war, and that ingenuity is something, I think, which works in their favor, which you don't have in the Russian side, because civil society and volunteers have been destroyed in Putin's dictatorship. So a lot of that works in Ukraine's favor as well, and that is something that the security services of Ukraine, both SBU and HRU, can take from and use in their various operations.
One biggish question. So why is it important that like Western intelligence services like the CIA, potentially MI6, and maybe even the French intelligence services, why is it important that they support the Ukrainian intelligence services, and what kind of lessons do you think they're learning with that relationship?
Well, this is real live war. If, as it seems now, Europeans are finally woken up to the fact that there could be a potential war down the road between NATO and Russia. Various Western, particularly European leaders, have talked about potentially a war between NATO and Russia in 3 to 5 years' time. If that is the case, then this war is a great way of learning about the Russian army, learning about how it fights, learning its weaknesses, and all of those factors can be worked in favor of NATO in the event of a war with Russia. So I think the collection of data and intelligence is as much something that is helpful to Western intelligence services as much as it is to Ukrainians. One factor, for example, is how this is the first drone war in history, and that is inevitably going to impact on how drone warfare is understood by Western and NATO armies. They're going to have to change their military strategies to accommodate that, because, as I've mentioned, it's always difficult for an army which is the one trying to take territory, as opposed to the army which is defensive. And it's even more difficult for armies to advance when you have drones all the time in the air, which can destroy equipment and people. And the cost. This war is showing how this is extremely cheap. So that is also going to have an impact on Western thinking, Western intelligence services, because of how this will impact upon the ability of terrorist groups as well. Could we imagine, for example, in Britain, we both grew up during the IRA campaign, during the Troubles, Could you imagine what would have happened in Britain, in the British mainland, if the IRA had drones in those days? And so that's also going to be something that's going to impact on counter-terrorism, counter-insurgency activities. What I noticed from my trip to Ukraine is to what degree this kind of equipment is so cheap. If you can buy these drones on Amazon for 400, 500 pounds, or build these kamikaze drones for $300, $400, I mean, that costs nothing. One of these kamikaze drones, which is built for, shall we say, $400, can destroy a tank or armored personnel carrier that costs millions of dollars. That just changes everything, and that can be observed in real time in Ukraine. And one of the things that certainly I'm sure is being observed, and you see this with the British Ministry of Defence's a daily update done by British military intelligence, is the manner in which Ukraine is using this drone warfare and other forms of warfare, artillery, but primarily drones, to kill huge numbers of Russian soldiers. The British Ministry of Defense noted that last month, February of 24, was the worst casualty month for Russia since the full-scale invasion began. And it was something like, it was, I mean, I found it difficult to believe the figures, but it said something like 980 per day killed, which sounds just incredible. If true, that probably means killed and wounded casualties. But when you look at the battlefield footage, and this is very easily found on, say, Twitter, you can see that Russian wounded are just left to die. So Western armies will, and the Ukrainian army takes the wounded out of the battlefield and usually is able to patch them up, and so they survive. But the Russian army, if you're wounded, sorry. And one reason that isn't just because they're cruel; it's also a corruption factor, because if those soldiers which are wounded are sent back, then the Russian state has to pay a compensation to the family. If no body is returned, then there's no compensation paid as well. So that's another factor there. But so I think that the Western armies and Western intelligence services are having a field day in the amount of information, intelligence, experiences that they're seeing on the ground, which inevitably will work in their favor in the event of a full-scale war between NATO and Russia down the road.
Yeah. And one other interesting thing that I think you pointed out to me a while back was that there's been reports of Ukrainian special forces operating outside of Ukraine, and obviously they're fighting the Wagner group in Sudan at the moment. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I don't. There isn't that much public information available about that, but I can imagine that the reasons are: yes, you're taking on this criminal formation, this Wagner mercenary group working on behalf of the Russian government. Putin finally admitted to that last year after denying it for many years. There's probably a financial aspect there because they're getting paid by the Sudanese government to do the fighting. So there's not just they're not just enjoying killing Russians; they're actually getting paid for it. But there's also apparently there's military supplies have been coming covertly from Sudan, probably via other countries, to Ukraine, including artillery shells. So I'm sure there's all sorts of aspects to this cooperation. The Ukrainians, though, unlike the Russians, have been less public in their discussion of their activities in Africa, because the Russians have been really loudly proclaiming this as their. They've taken on board, shall we say, Soviet propaganda about how Russia is the successor to the Soviet Union in fighting Western colonialism in Africa, which of course is baloney, but this is what they're talking about. The Ukrainians have been actually a bit quieter about that.
No, that's fair enough, and it's an interesting thing that, and I'm fascinated by Wagner and Russia and Africa at the moment, because again, to repeat myself, I hear a lot about what the West has got up to, past and present, but I hear very little or any acknowledgement about what Russia or even China are up to in Africa right now. Because listening to some leftist colleagues and friends, occasionally you think that the CIA have kind of completely got Africa under their thumb, when in reality it's a very different situation at the moment.
Well, I mean, it is as well, and the Russian involvement, or the Wagner Group's involvement on behalf of the Russian government, is purely colonial. They are propping up very brutal regimes in return for financial gain, in return for helping those brutal regimes to steal resources and money from those people who are in those countries. So they're openly doing this. They're not even hiding it. Whereas I don't think the French special forces in Mali were out there to sort of raid and steal the mineral resources in Mali. I mean, they were there for a specific job. So the Wagner army is actually far more colonial, or traditionally colonial in that sense.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. One of my two bonus questions, if you have time. So the first one is about the Nord Stream pipeline attacks in 2022, because there's an awful lot of speculation of who's responsible, and Ukrainian special forces get brought up in this. I was wondering if you had any insight into who is responsible for the Nord Stream pipe attack.
I guess I'm not very objective here. I mean, I always assumed it was the Russians.
Me too. So.
I mean, I just didn't think the Ukrainians would have the capabilities to do something like that. But maybe I wasn't right on that. But more importantly, I didn't see why the Ukrainians would have a motivation to do that. Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 didn't really affect Ukraine after the full-scale invasion, because if there hadn't been the invasion, and if the Nord Stream 2 pipeline had gone ahead as planned, then that would have had eventually an impact on Ukraine, because it would have led to the closing of Russian transit of gas across Ukraine. But with the full-scale invasion, Germany ended Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. And so it was no longer really a threat to Ukraine's economy or Ukraine's transit of gas. So I stretched and wondered why Ukraine would waste resources and potentially be caught doing it, trying to blow this pipeline up. It seemed to be more the case that if we think back to 2022, the Russians were absolutely convinced. This is how arrogant they were. They were absolutely convinced that Europe would freeze to death in winter without Russian gas, and they were determined to show that this was going to be the case. And one way I think that they were going to do that was by forever closing down Nord Stream pipeline, Nord Stream 2 anyway, Nord Stream 1 and 2, by blowing them up. In the end, that wasn't the case. Europe didn't freeze, and Europe has survived without Russian gas. But back in 2022, when Europe reacted to the full-scale invasion and did impose sanctions on Russia and did say that we're going to become finally energy independent of Russia, the Russians didn't believe them. And they thought that they couldn't survive without Russian gas. And your listeners should understand that Russian gas has been supplied to Europe since Soviet times. We're talking, I think, since the 70s. these pipelines going across Belarus and Ukraine to Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia, probably Romania as well, were built in Soviet times. And so this supply of Russian gas has been going on for 50 years. This changed only with the building of Nord Stream 1 and 2, bringing Russian gas directly to Germany. But Russia lost all that in 2022, so it lost a huge chunk of its government budget. But of course, there always were loopholes. Those loopholes were things like Russia exporting crude oil to India, then it refined it, and then that oil came back to Europe and to Britain. But still not on the same volume as what it used to be like. And anyway, we have now a new factor in that the Ukrainian intelligence services are doing a far greater job in implementing Western sanctions against Russia than the West itself.
Yes.
By launching drone attacks on Russian oil and gas refineries and on gas depots. And so far they've knocked out about 15% of Russian oil production, and that is obviously going to continue. It's sort of quite methodical what the Ukrainians are doing. So that is already having an impact on Russia, and that is going to, I think, continue to have a major impact. There was a Reuters report just a day or so ago which said that the one thing that could potentially bring Russia to the negotiating table is if Ukraine successfully knocks out Russia's oil and gas industry with these drone attacks. If these continue and we're getting up to 50, 60, 70% knocked out, then Russia's in dire straits, because literally Russia is Nigeria with nuclear weapons. I mean, the only exports it ever really had were energy and military technology, weapons. And various reports in the last few weeks have shown that Russia's military exports have collapsed since 2022. Not many countries want to buy Russian military equipment anymore. Surprise, surprise, because it hasn't been shown to be very good in Ukraine. And now its energy exports are suffering. They already were with Europe, but they're now going to be suffering more with these Ukrainian attacks. So that's going to have a major squeeze on the Russian government budget. So, but back on to the question of Nord Stream, I still believe that I don't see what the Ukrainians would gain from that, from the destruction of Nord Stream 1 and 2. Especially because it was done in the summer of 2022 when Ukraine was really desperate for Western help in the fight against Russia. The West came very late with that help, and because it didn't believe Ukraine was going to be successful fighting Russia, and so originally the West was only going to send weapons for guerrilla warfare. They saw the Ukrainians were successful in the Kyiv region. The Russian troops left by late March, early April, and then more advanced equipment started to flow. Why would the Ukrainians, if they were caught blowing those up, potentially damage that supply of that transfer of Western military equipment? I think that would have been something that would have dwelt on Ukrainian minds and not really would have made them not really want to do something like that. So I would still point the finger at Russia.
Yeah, well, to my mind, when I first sort of heard about it and read about it and thought about it, it to me felt more like a Russian operation, and if anything, maybe the goal was to disrupt relations between Europe and Ukraine.
Well, sure, that would be a secondary, shall we say, add-on good thing for them. But I think going back to that point, I think back at that period of time, middle of 2022, the Kremlin was absolutely convinced that Europe couldn't survive without Russian gas. and that they're going to have, and so this was one other way to show that was the case.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I'm sure in time we'll probably find out more, but
We will. Eventually, there'll be some leak, or
yeah.
or Bellingcat will buy some data for some corrupt Russian official.
Yeah. We'll find out how we stacked up on that one. But there we go. I have one last bonus question if you have time for it. I feel like we slightly covered it, but I wouldn't mind asking it in this direct way and then see what you think of it. So I had this sort of conversation with this taxi driver just recently on Ukraine. He seemed quite a young, educated guy, so I was a bit surprised about his views. And they were kind of these rather convoluted views that to me were a bit of a hybrid of the far left and post-colonial talking points. And so I'm going to try and summarize kind of what he said to me. He said that he felt that Putin's actions were on par with the US response to the Cuban Missile Crisis. He also went on to say that post-Soviet Russia had offered Ukraine a better deal than European powers had in Africa, and that the war is largely the fault of the CIA and NATO manipulating Ukraine for their warmongering and Cold War thinking. So I was wondering, what if you had a conversation with a taxi driver who said that, what would you say to that taxi driver, and what are your thoughts on those?
Well, I'm assuming you had that conversation in London, probably, right?
Yes, it was in London.
I think you've got the problem of refugees who have come out to the West right at the beginning of the war, and those people from the same, could be even from the same region of the country that he comes from, still staying back home, because he's come out to the West in, shall we say, the beginning of the full-scale invasion, with those pro-Russian views which have just frozen. They haven't changed with the course of the war, whereas his, shall we say, friends or people or acquaintances that he knows from Eastern Ukraine who have suffered over 2 years of the war, their views have moved on, as it were. And I experienced that myself with this visit to Ukraine. So I think he's just somebody that's stuck in those pre-invasion positioning on those various questions, very much repeating Kremlin disinformation and propaganda about this. That, if it wasn't for the West, then Ukrainians and Russians would somehow still continue to be brothers and close buddies. And that view was already deteriorating after 2014, but it completely got eviscerated after 2022. So you will not hear that same kind of viewpoint in a taxi in Ukraine. And you're right to point this out, because often you can get some of the most interesting conversations with taxi drivers. And I've had that myself in Ukraine. So I think that he's just a reflection of that kind of viewpoint that existed in the past, but as now no longer to be found in Ukraine. What changed between 2014 2022? In 2014, that was already a shock to many Eastern Ukrainians that Russia had come in and stolen Crimea and started the war in the Donbas region of Eastern Ukraine. But after 2014, Ukrainians had very negative views of Russian leaders. So 80-90% were negative about Putin and other people like that. But they weren't yet fully negative about the Russian people. But after 2022, that completely changed to Ukrainians having still very negative views of the Russian leaders, but also very negative views of the Russian people. So his kind of approach that, Ukrainians and Russians would still be close buddies, close brothers, if it wasn't for the CIA or NATO or whatever, is something that no longer anybody believes inside Ukraine. It's not just because of the invasion; it's because of what the Russian army is doing inside Ukraine. Just the massive range. These are not isolated incidents, and the United Nations just released their latest report on these war crimes just a few days ago. It's just massive. I mean, just for example, on the raping side, they've been raping girls from the age of 4 to women at the age of 82. So this is still Stalin's army from the late part of the World War II that raped its way across Poland and Germany to Berlin. It's the same mentality, same army, same brutality, and same zombification of soldiers who will complain one day on social media about how they're treated and their conditions, and then on the next day will willingly join a line as cannon fodder and be murdered and killed.
Yeah. Do you know what you've reminded me of? There was just something recently of a captured Russian soldier who had this sort of like wish list of things to achieve during the war.
Yes, I saw.
And on there was rape,
Yes.
wasn't there? And,
yes.
Poorly.
So Ukraine is like a safari for them. That they're going there for to make some money, to do the kind of illegal activities that they can't do back home. There was a video just a couple of days ago of a Russian soldier in Avdiivka. He basically filmed it for his wife, who maybe put it on social media. He said, "Look, I'm in Avdiivka. Look at this place. We've just liberated it." I mean, the place was all destroyed, but saying, "Look," he was really proud that they were liberated it. And he says, "We're going around the apartments, and they're full of goodies. I just need to find a truck and to take all this stuff and send it back to you." And he was bragging about it. I mean, there you are. I mean, again, it's the same, just like the Soviet army in late World War II, stealing whatever it could and sending it back to the Soviet Union. Nothing's changed.
No. And this is why, yet again, I'll bring it up. This is why it boggles my mind. There are people on the left who still have this rosy-eyed view of communism and Soviet Russia. I find it fascinating.
It's even more bizarre because whatever you might think of Jeremy Corbyn, he's a committed socialist, and he's stuck. Whereas other politicians keep wavering in their views, he's stuck to the same dogged socialist position since the 1970s. I don't agree with him, but okay, you've stuck to them. So you're a socialist. So why the hell are you supporting a mafia corrupt regime in Russia? This has got nothing to do with socialism. It's got nothing to do with the Soviet Union. It's a kleptocratic mafia regime. It's been called that since 2010. That's the first time I saw it in a U.S. diplomatic cable leaked to WikiLeaks.
Yeah. I remember
so
that. Yeah.
Fine if you're a socialist and you have nostalgia for the Soviet Union. That's got bugger all to do with contemporary Russia, which is a mafia state that treats its people like cattle, like sheep. The Soviet Union was far better in the way it treated its people. So what is difficult to understand about this left-wing position is why does this nostalgia, this socialism and this nostalgia of the Soviet Union translate into love of this horrible regime inside Russia? And the only way you can explain that is because, and the same with Jeremy Corbyn, is that their anti-Americanism trumps everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're pro-Russian because you're anti-American. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And it's it's leading to people some very weird intellectual kind of convolution. It's really bizarre.
Yes. Although they have to be a bit more cautious today because of just the state of what Russia is up to inside Ukraine. I mean, I think it's more difficult to defend Russia today than it was in 2014.
Unless you're a taxi driver in London.
Unless you're a taxi driver and you're pretty clueless about what's going on. Yeah.
Bless them. Well, before we part ways, is there anything else you'd like to add at all? I
would just recommend to change the taxi company you use.
Yeah, it's disappointing. It's actually one of my favourite firms, that one, but I won't name it.
Switch to Uber.
Actually, well, yeah, I probably should. It wasn't an Uber. It was actually a private company. There we go. They won't be sponsoring this episode. Oh dear. Well, Taras, thank you so much for your time today. Is there, where can listeners sort of find out more about you and your work?
I think the easiest way is always to do a Google search because and anything I publish always goes up on my Twitter account. So where I'm relatively active as well in commenting about various things. One of the bees in my I have at the moment, for example, is about how you often get Western liberal journalists talking about how the Russian people don't support the war, and and it's just simply not true. But of course, it makes them feel better because. And we had the same debates in World War II in Britain and elsewhere. Is this a fight against Nazism, or is this a fight against the German people as well? Because they're supporting Nazism. So I don't think these debates are new, but I have an article coming out soon which actually collects together lots of different evidence about the Russian public on the whole supporting the war. And somebody pointed out just a few days ago that there was quite a large German exodus from Germany when the Nazis took power. And those Germans abroad created a very powerful anti-Nazi movement. There's been millions of Russians who have either moved or fled abroad since 1991, and particularly in the last few years. And yet they have not created a very powerful anti-Putin movement. And one has to ask, why did the Germans do that and not the Russians? And so I think there is, one has to appreciate, and I think Western policymakers need to appreciate that this war that Putin's undertaking does have a lot of popular support inside the country. This is not just Putin's madness. There is a lot of people have bought into that Western xenophobia. And that they are fighting the West in Ukraine.
Well, there's a lot of wishful thinking, and sorry to hold on for one more now, but like the Navalny was sort of held up as this figure who's somehow going to liberate Russia from Putin, very much in the West that it was seen this way, and obviously he's now dead, murdered by Putin in some way, and so I find it really fascinating that there is this sort of thing.
Well, we've had this for decades. I remember as a teenager reading Alexander Solzhenitsyn because his books were translated into English, published by Penguin, and I gobbled them all up. I loved them, and it's the same thing. We saw him as this riding a white horse and about to liberate Russians from Soviet communism, and then he came out he was exchanged in a spy swap, I think it was, and he came out to the West. He went to live in beautiful Vermont in New England in the US, and he started hammering and criticizing the West.
Yeah,
and we were all shocked and saying, what the hell's going on? I thought he was ours. I thought he was our Western supporter in Russia. But no, he was basically like Navalny. He was a liberal Russian nationalist, but still a Russian nationalist. And therefore, he's quite critical of the West. And you can actually do this by going back, and a lot of the things that today Putin is complaining about and criticizing the West for, Solzhenitsyn was doing that 5 decades ago or 4 decades ago. For example, that the West has lost its spirituality, its family values, all of those kind of things. It's not religious anymore, whereas Russians have kept up that spirituality and adherence to religion. Solzhenitsyn was saying that back then, and Putin is saying that today. And with Navalny, the same. I mean, I think that there's a lot of criticism in the case of Ukraine. Navalny is not a popular figure. The First Lady, President Zelensky's spouse, she refused to attend Biden's State of the Union speech recently because she would have been sat next to Navalny's spouse. Ukraine and Georgia and the people living in the Caucasus have a very negative view of Navalny because in the 2000s, he was actually extreme nationalist. He called people, the peoples living in the Caucasus, Navalny called them, the video is still on YouTube, he called them cockroaches. Some of this language is worse than what we hear from Donald Trump about Latinos. And he supported the invasion of Georgia. He supported the annexation of Crimea, and he also said, like Russian nationalists like Putin, that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. So Ukrainians don't have a very positive view of Navalny. They see him as typically one of these Russian liberals whose liberalism ends at the Ukrainian border. But more importantly, I think that their strategy was very weak. And their strategy was to go on the last day of voting at midday and just to go inside and spoil your ballot. I think a lot of people, including myself, were very critical of this strategy of the Navalny team, because by participating in these fraudulent elections, you give legitimacy to these Putin's elections. It would have been far better for them to go in and burn those ballot boxes, as some Russians did, or pour green dye in, as other Russians did, inside those ballot boxes, rather than participating, because there was the choice open to Russians was Putin and three other clowns, puppets, who were there just to make it look like a real election, when in fact they were all. There was a leader of the Liberal Democratic Party, the leader of the Communists, and leader of this new Russia party. These are all parties controlled by the Kremlin. And so I don't think the Navalny strategy was very, very useful there. And the other, I think, criticism that many of us have made is that they don't seem to grasp the connection between the regime inside Russia, the totalitarian dictatorship that murdered Alexei Navalny and other politicians like Nemtsov in 2015 and others, and how that regime is invading and doing war crimes in Ukraine. The two things are very closely interconnected. Russia, there's a cult of war in this totalitarian dictatorship in Russia, and that cult of war and cult of the Great Patriotic War, cult of Stalin, is leading to this acute military aggression and war crimes in Ukraine. And yet the Navalny team don't seem to understand that, and therefore they don't make very many comments about the war in Ukraine. Alexei Navalny's spouse has barely mentioned Ukraine. So it is rather strange, yes, but you're right, absolutely right, that many liberal romantics in the West, on a variety of publications, do want to grasp at something inside Russia to say, look, all hope isn't gone. There's Navalny or there's somebody else. Well, Navalny is a very mixed case. I mean, he became democratic only later, but in the 2000s, for at least a decade, he was extreme nationalist, and every year he would march along with neo-Nazis and nationalists in this what's called the Russia Day. It was always in November, where they'd march and chant very horrible slogans. So we should be cautious. We've wanted to find angels before in Russia, and we've had our fingers burnt, as it were. So we have to be very careful.
Yeah, indeed. I the day after he died, I finally watched the Navalny documentary, and he brushes off the nationalism thing. I didn't realize he'd been a nationalist for a decade. He kind of made it out that he was, as a rising politician, needs to make friends. And then there was another weird bit in the documentary a lot later where I think his PR person, he were having a quick discussion about something, and it all just seemed a bit dodgy.
Yes, no, it's not. I'm surprised he never took off the video from YouTube. I found it a few days ago. I went to look for it again. It's there. I mean, where he calls people in the Caucasus cockroachs. These things are there. Throughout the 2000s, up till Putin came back as president in 2012, he was on the far right, and then he kind of changed from 2012, and shall we say became a liberal nationalist, so more on the far right of what, say, the Conservative Party in Britain. But he was, he's got a mixed history, and he's never really condemned what happened before. I mean, for example, supporting the invasion of Georgia in 2008.
Yeah, usually when one changes, you usually acknowledge that past in some way.
Yeah, you can blame it on youthful indiscretion, or I didn't know what I was talking about, or I was swayed by somebody or whatever. You should condemn that, right, if you're moving to a new position. But he's not really done that there.
No, indeed. Well, I think we better wrap up, but thank you so much for all of that today. It's been a really great conversation, and people can connect with you on Twitter, can't they?
Yes, they can. That's probably the easiest, where most of my publications are available. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thanks again for your time today.
Okay then, thanks again.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.